In our last video, we took a first look at the Gerber Scientific Model 6200 computer. Today, we're going to dig into it even further and find out all of the intricacies of this fine machine here on Vintage Geek. Just a quick reminder, if you like what you see today, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us a lot as we grow, and one of the things that helps us out the most is if you would consider becoming a Vintage Geek member. You can do that at the website, and for just under $20 a year, you get access to all of our content commercial-free. It's at vintagegeek.com. Last week, when we took the first look at the Gerber computer here, I was just amazed with the overall engineering and build quality of this machine, but I still have very little idea what it actually was for or what it does. Now, since the time of filming that, we have found a little bit more information online. I actually found a Computer World article back from 1976 that was announcing this particular model being sold with another plotter device in a package for about $52,000, which is an amazing sticker price for the time. That also gave me the inkling that this is designed to be a controller for another device. So this is consistent with some of the things that we were theorizing last time, that maybe this was designed to control some kind of a plotter. And that seems to be consistent with this article from Computer World, as well as some of the other materials that we've gotten since then, as far as the tapes and some of the accessories that came with the system. In fact, we do have a box of the half-inch reel tapes that were designed for this particular Gerber machine, and while we don't know the contents of those tapes, nor can we read them yet, there are some labels on a few of them that indicate what kind of files or data would be stored. And from everything we've seen so far, these labels seem to indicate that these were actually files containing data on printed circuit boards. There are some notations referring to component level design and various things that you would find on a printed circuit board. There are also tapes in the collection that seem to indicate they are drill locations, which would be consistent with printed circuit board design. This led me down another little rabbit hole on the internet of looking up things Gerber has done in the past, like creating a universal file format for creating printed circuit boards in the electronics industry. Essentially, you could print a circuit board using a vector graphics system, X and Y coordinates. They were instrumental in creating a file format that could be exchanged between computers, and that file format is actually still used in a slightly modified version today, which I found very interesting. So it does seem like, from everything we've seen, that the Model 6200 was a device that was designed to control a plotter device, either for making printed circuit boards or actually creating the designs of those circuit boards. I'm not sure which, but I definitely want to get further into the machine. We really only got to look at the front components in the last video and kind of getting into the tape drive and power supplies. So I want to take a look at the side and back of the Gerber unit today, see what else is inside, and really just get a better feel for how this whole machine is put together right here on Vintage Geek. Both of the side panels of the Gerber Scientific machine can be removed. It's not too difficult to get those panels off. Once they are off, it does reveal that the construction of this entire chassis actually has a second set of rack rails toward the back, so you could actually mount things facing both directions in the cabinet, which is kind of interesting. And it allows you to have a rear access door where you can kind of keep things hidden away, which I'm sure would have been convenient at the time. There's not a whole lot to talk about in these side views, but it is very convenient. If you're trying to work on something, being able to get into it from the side, I'm sure was very helpful, depending on where this unit was placed in your facility back in those days. But now I want to take a look at the back of the unit, and let's open up this back door and see what's inside. I continue to be impressed by the overall build quality of this machine. It reminds me a lot actually of early broadcast transmitters, just the way that this is all put together, the terminal strips and so forth that we're going to cover here in a minute. But I want to make mention first of all of something outside of the door, and that is of course the serial number plate that's at the top left-hand side of the cabinet. As we've talked about with this machine, there are some pieces missing when it comes to serial numbers, and I think that may be because this was possibly a prototype machine. Now, it does show the model number on the serial number plate. It does actually have a serial number of 46. It's a very low serial number, so this is definitely early in a production run. But I think it's interesting that the other two fields on the serial number plate are blank. It just leads to some of the mystery behind this machine, and I'm very intrigued by it. Moving into the actual cabinet itself, we have the main breaker for the cabinet, which is exposed through the door, so you could turn that breaker on or off with the door closed. It's a 30 amp 240 volt breaker, which means this thing would draw a hefty amount of current with everything running, and at 240 volts it's kind of a beast. But looking at the way that the power distribution is set up is even more impressive. To the right of that main breaker, we actually have another self-contained power supply. I don't know why that is in a separate chassis like it is, but it's interesting nonetheless. Then below that, we actually have two contactors Now I recognize these because of being in the radio industry and radio transmitters. It appears there would have been some control mechanism in the actual controller itself that probably engaged these main contactors to apply primary voltage to the system. That was to, I assume, avoid having some kind of large form factor toggle switch or other way of turning on power to the unit. I don't have any of the paperwork or schematics to show how that would have functioned exactly, but again, I've seen this in other designs and it does kind of make sense. Below that, we have a series of smaller breakers. I have to assume these were for individual components in the system. Maybe there was a separate breaker for the controller unit itself, a separate breaker for the tape drive. Not sure how that's configured, but it looks like there's quite a bit of thought that went into the power distribution here so that you could isolate components and keep things separate when you were doing troubleshooting. To the right of all that are a series of terminal strips, and these are pretty heavy grade industrial style terminal strips that I assume is where you would connect other peripherals to the system. As we've theorized, this particular unit was probably designed to control a large plotter, and I assume that that would have a number of connections that would have to be made between this particular rack and the plotter itself. Maybe there was power connections, maybe there was a bunch of different data connections, and I assume that's going to explain some of the cables we'll see toward the bottom of the cabinet as well. Now, as we move further down, we can actually see the backside of the controller unit itself, and the cool part here is that there actually is another serial number badge on it showing that this is model 6000. I did read somewhere online that the company made a model 6000 and a model 6200 controller, so I'm not sure if maybe this is a hybrid between those two models, or maybe it used some components from the 6000, some from the 6200. Don't know for sure, but it's good that we have these plates to at least give us some indication. The back of this controller reveals that there are 4 different plug-in cards, and we're going to take a look at those in just a little bit, but I want to cover the rest of the components that are actually in the chassis before we start taking cards out of the system. When we move down from the controller unit in the rack, there's another rack panel that actually has some power distribution type things on it. There's a couple of fuse holders on this. There's also a toggle switch that is for power on off, as well as a 115 volt pilot indicator and a system fault indicator, along with a fault reset button. Now, I'm not sure if this is a separate power supply for a different part of the system. Maybe this was supposed to be something that would control the external device rather than the internal tape drive. I really don't know a lot about how this device is structured electronically, and I'm hoping that at some point we'll uncover some schematics or something in our research that will give us a little bit more indication on how all of this worked together. But the overall build quality is great, and it does look like there is some additional protection with those fuses on this panel. Now, moving further down from here, we get a little bit more complicated because we have a lot more wires in the cabinet at this point, and I assume this is because all of these cables probably interfaced with that external plotter device. There's at least one cable here that is a multi-pin connector that's pretty large form factor and has a lot of signals that could be transferred over it. That had to have been for the plotter device, I would imagine, just based on the complexity there. There's also a large power cable, which I think would have supplied the primary power to the unit. It does look like it has a 240 volt plug on the end of it, so that would probably plug into your power source and then go into the main power distribution toward the top of the rack. A lot of cables here, a lot of things going on, but as we get toward the very bottom of the rack, you can see the back of the card cage that we looked at in the first video. You can kind of see all of the connectors going to that card cage, which is nice to see. And then if you get all the way at the bottom, there's actually a 110 volt AC distribution panel that has your standard 110 outlets across the bottom. And I assume that you could plug in other things there, whether you had some kind of external controller device, or maybe you just need to plug in a lamp to get a better look at everything inside the rack if this was in a darker space. I'm not really sure, but there seems to be ample capacity for electrical distribution in the back of the Gerber machine. Really interesting to see kind of how this is all assembled. So now I want to take a closer look at these 4 cards that are in the back of the actual controller unit. We saw the actual wiring go into these cards in the first video, and I'm really curious as what we're going to find on those cards, so let's get into it. Starting at the first slot at the very top of the chassis, we have a card that's labeled the GNS-2-1. No idea what that actually means, but this is a very well-built card. This one's interesting to me though, because there actually is a green tag attached to it that has a date stamp of 1983. Which is interesting because the rest of the date stamps in this unit appear to be late 70s, like 1979. So this may have been a card that they either swapped out or added to the system later on. And it does have the Gerber badging on the actual green tag. The green tag on this does show that it was tested okay in a 6000 simulator. One thing I've learned from this is that they must have had a simulator control unit that they could test cards in, which is actually pretty cool. But other than that, I really don't know much about this card, so I'm just going to move on to the next one. In the next slot down, we have a really interesting card. This one's labeled the GNS-1-3. Now, this particular card has a lot of different components on it that are hand labeled. So there's a number of different ICs on the front that may be microprocessors, I'm not really sure, but these each have a handwritten label on them, and they all have a 1983 date code. So this is consistent with that first card, but again, different than the date of the overall chassis of the system. There are a number of different handwritten things on this board, and then looking at the back side of the board, it gets even more wild with just tons of wire wrap components. There was a couple of things that looked like they were added by hand after the fact. Just really interesting overall. There's also a large ribbon cable that connects this card to the tape drive unit that we looked at in the first video, as well as a small ribbon connector that goes into the controller itself, possibly to the front panel control switches. So it looks like this particular card is definitely at the heart of the system, and I'd love to know more about what it does. Next up, we have the GNS-1-1. So at least things are kind of going in sequence as we go down the card cage here. This particular card looks like it's populated with just tons of ICs that are socketed, and on the back side, again, we have a ton of wire wrap going on, some hand-placed components. This is just all really intriguing to me. I don't know how much of this was done by hand when these cards were assembled, but the build quality is really interesting to look at, and that only leaves one more card in the card cage to examine today. The final card in the cage actually does not have a standard number like the other three, and it is on a green printed circuit board rather than the kind of tan or brownish color that the other ones were. So this is a little bit different, but the handwriting looks similar on the ICs that are socketed on the board. There's a lot of references on these handwritten labels to ASCII, and everything that I've read about the Gerber format seems to indicate that all of this was done in some kind of an ASCII text format as far as putting down the coordinates that were actually transferred to the tapes that could essentially store the data of these printed circuit board designs. Again, really fascinated on how all of this worked, how these cards function together in the system, and what they were capable of without having any, I guess, software to control them. Was this all basically hardware embedded in the code? Were they on the ROMs? I really don't know, and I'm so excited to find out more as we pursue our research into the Gerber Scientific 6200. So for now, I'm going to close up the Gerber Scientific 6200. It's been good to take a look at this today, but just kind of digging into it further as we go deeper and deeper, it just seems like more of a maze. I've really enjoyed taking a close look at the Gerber Scientific Model 6200. I think it's a fascinating machine, and I'd love to know more about how it works and what it does. And I'm sure that some of you out there may have some experience. Maybe you knew someone that worked for Gerber Scientific. Maybe you yourself worked for Gerber Scientific, or you just know something about it. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below, because it's going to help us kind of unravel the mysteries of this machine and figure out how maybe someday when we actually do this thing is going to come to life, and it'll be absolutely amazing. I wanted to mention very quickly that I very much appreciate everyone that sounded off in the comments in our last Gerber video. All of the insight and information that you provided on this potentially being a plotter device and some of the specifics on the tape drive and a lot more were really helpful in putting together this video and learning more about this classic machine. So again, thanks to all of our viewers for making this information possible. Just a reminder, if you like vintage technology and classic computers like the Gerber Scientific, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps us a lot here at the channel, and one of the things that helps us the most is if you would consider becoming a Vintage Geek member. You can do that at the website, and for just under $20 a year, you get access to all of our content commercial free, plus we have some bonus extras and more. It's all at vintagegeek.com. Until next time, I'm Aaron, and this has been Vintage Geek.